The sun was just starting to creep over the horizon on May 14, 1264, when a small, determined army of rebels quietly formed on the high downs outside the town of Lewes in Sussex. The air was thick with tension, and the only sounds were the soft whispers of men preparing for battle. Simon de Montfort, a 56-year-old nobleman with a broken leg, was wheeled to the front lines on a cart. Despite his injury, his eyes burned with resolve. This was his moment, and he was ready to fight. Below them, a much larger royal army was already forming. King Henry III's forces, led by his son, Lord Edward, stretched for nearly a mile. The royalists were angry and determined, ready to crush the rebels who had defied their king. The rebels, however, were not intimidated. They wore white crosses on their tunics, a symbol of their cause and their determination to stand against what they saw as a corrupt and ineffective monarchy. The last time a pitched battle had been fought in England was nearly 50 years ago, and most of the knights on both sides had never seen one. But today, there was no avoiding the clash. Simon de Montfort's men were zealous, and the royalists were relentless. The stage was set for a decisive showdown. As the sun rose higher, the tension grew. Simon de Montfort's army, though smaller, was filled with young aristocrats who admired his courage and believed in his cause. They were ready to fight for a new kind of England, one where the king was bound by the laws and the will of his people. On the other side, Lord Edward, just a month shy of his 25th birthday, was a fierce and experienced warrior. He had grown up in a world of shifting loyalties and constant conflict. His father, King Henry III, had been a weak and indecisive ruler, and Edward had seen the kingdom fracture under his watch. Now he was determined to restore the king's authority and crush the rebellion once and for all. The battle began with a deafening roar. Edward, leading the right flank, charged at the rebel division made up mostly of Londoners. These were not professional soldiers. They were civilians who had joined the rebellion out of frustration with the king. Edward's cavalry easily shattered their lines, driving them back across the valley and into the River Ouse. His men pursued the fleeing Londoners, cutting them down as they ran. The carnage was brutal, and by the time Edward's forces returned to the battlefield, the royalists were in chaos. While Edward was off chasing the rebels, the center and left flanks of the royal army had been pushed back. King Henry's division was forced to retreat behind the walls of Lewes Priory, while Richard, Earl of Cornwall, found himself surrounded and took refuge in a nearby windmill. The royalists were in disarray, and the rebels, sensing victory, pressed their advantage. When Edward returned to the battlefield, he found his father's forces in retreat and his uncle trapped. The royal army was on the brink of defeat. The rebels, led by Simon de Montfort, demanded a surrender. They threatened to execute the captured nobles, including Richard, if the king did not agree to their terms. Henry had no choice but to negotiate. The peace that was hammered out that day, known as the Miss of Lewes, reinstated the provisions of Oxford, which had been designed to limit the king's power and increase the influence of the barons. King Henry remained the titular ruler, but he was now a puppet, controlled by Simon de Montfort. Edward and his cousin, Henry of Almaine, were taken prisoner. The once proud Plantagenet dynasty was now on its knees, and the future of the kingdom hung in the balance. As the sun set on that fateful day, the battlefield was strewn with the dead and the dying. The air was thick with the stench of blood and the cries of the wounded. Simon de Montfort stood tall, his eyes scanning the horizon. The war was far from over, but for now the rebels had won. The Plantagenet Empire, once vast and powerful, was now a shadow of its former self. The world was changing, and the old ways of kingship were giving way to a new era. The future of England was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Battle of Lewes had marked the beginning of a new chapter in the nation's history. Simon de Montfort found himself in a tricky situation. He had defeated King Henry III and taken control of the kingdom, but this wasn't an easy job. He was just a nobleman trying to run a country, and many people didn't like that. He had beaten his own king, which made him a controversial figure. Edward, the king's son, had formed close friendships with powerful lords like Sir Roger Mortimer and others. These lords were angry with de Montfort and opposed his rule. De Montfort tried to strengthen his position by giving himself and his sons, Henry and Simon the Younger, lots of land and castles that belonged to the king's supporters. This didn't go down well with many nobles, especially Gilbert de Clare, the young Earl of Gloucester. Gloucester had fought bravely with de Montfort, but became disillusioned with his autocratic style of rule. He was particularly upset about how de Montfort treated King Edward, who was kept under house arrest. De Montfort tried to ease tensions by releasing Edward from captivity in March 1265, but he still kept Edward under strict supervision. Edward was not allowed to have his lands back, and he had to be accompanied by de Montfort's son, Henry, wherever he went. By early 1265, Gloucester and others began to suspect that de Montfort wanted to take the crown for himself. In February 1265, Gloucester left de Montfort's court and went to his estates in Wales, claiming they were being attacked. He stayed away from a tournament, and by May, it was clear he had abandoned de Montfort and was plotting with the loyal lords to free Edward and restore the king's power. On May 28, 1265, Edward was allowed to go riding in Hereford, a place where many loyal lords lived. He was still guarded by Henry de Montfort, but he also had friends with him, including Gloucester's brother, Thomas de Clare. They played a game to find the fastest horse, but it was really a plan for Edward to escape. When he found the right horse, he shouted to his guards, "Good day, lords, greet my father well, and tell him I hope to see him soon and release him from custody." Then he rode away, joined by a few friends who knew about the plan. They picked up Sir Roger Mortimer from the woods and headed to Mortimer's castle at Wigmore, then to Ludlow, where Edward met Gloucester. Edward promised to restore good laws, get rid of bad customs, and let native Englishmen run the government. This was exactly what the barons had demanded years earlier. With this new alliance, a royalist coalition formed, including exiles and loyal lords. They set up defenses by destroying bridges over the River Severn, trapping de Montfort in Wales. De Montfort tried to gather an army, but Edward's forces were already strong and determined. They chased de Montfort around Wales, and young Simon de Montfort tried to bring in more troops from the east. On August 1st, the Royalists attacked young Simon at Kenilworth. Simon was staying at a priory nearby, and he was caught off guard. He escaped by rowing away naked, but many of his knights were captured. When the elder de Montfort heard about this, he was shaken. He knew the situation was critical. He tried to unite his forces and escape, but Edward's army was close behind. On August 4th, de Montfort's army paused for breakfast at Evesham Abbey. The sky was dark, and a storm was brewing. De Montfort's men saw what they thought were young Simon's banners, but it was actually Edward's army, using the banners they had captured. De Montfort realized he was trapped. His men were outnumbered, and escape was impossible. The battle began in the rain. De Montfort fought bravely, but he was overwhelmed. His son Henry was killed, and another son, Guy, was captured. King Henry, who was with de Montfort, was wounded but saved when he shouted his name to an attacking knight. De Montfort himself was killed by Roger Mortimer, who thrust a lance into his neck. His body was mutilated, and parts were sent to his enemies as trophies. The Battle of Evesham was a decisive victory for Edward. De Montfort, his son Henry, and many other rebels were killed. King Henry was returned to his son, and the Royalists celebrated. But the country was still divided, and healing the wounds of the conflict would be a long and difficult process. Edward, now the dominant figure, had to help his father restore order. However, Henry III made a mistake by declaring that all Montfortian rebels would be permanently disinherited, and their lands given to loyalists. This decision angered many families and prolonged the war. Edward and his allies had a challenging task ahead, but they were determined to bring peace and stability to the kingdom. Edward's role after the Battle of Evesham was a mix of mercy and harshness. He had wept at the loss of so many lives and showed clemency to some of the leading Montfortians who begged not to lose their lands. But when his father, Henry III, announced harsh penalties for the rebels, Edward didn't resist. He accepted rewards and took part in the retribution, even dispossessing disloyal citizens in London and taking a valuable prisoner, the mayor. As the Royalists tightened their grip, many rebels, now called the Disinherited, fled to the woods and formed guerrilla bands, much like the legendary Robin Hood. Kenilworth Castle became a major center of resistance, but by Christmas 1265, revolts were breaking out all over England. Edward was busy putting down these rebellions and learned that sometimes mercy was more effective than force. In December, he convinced a group of rebels in Lincolnshire to surrender without a fight. Later, he worked with Roger Leybourne to subdue the Cinque Ports, offering pardons and freedom in exchange for submission. However, Henry III's desire for revenge made things difficult. By Easter 1266, rebellions were widespread, and Edward had to fight more battles. One memorable event was a duel with Adam Gurdon, a skilled knight in Alton Wood. Edward won, hanged Gurdon's companions, and gave Gurdon to his mother, who made him pay a steep price for his freedom. Despite the ongoing conflicts, the Royalists gradually gained the upper hand. By summer, they laid siege to Kenilworth Castle, a massive fortress defended by 1,000 men. Edward's brother Edmund led the siege, but Edward focused on other rebellions and the birth of his first son, John. After months of struggle, it became clear that Kenilworth could only be starved into submission. Papal legate Ottobuono and Henry of Almaine proposed the dictum of Kenilworth, a document that allowed rebels to buy back their lands at a high price. This was a step toward peace, and the garrison at Kenilworth surrendered in December 1266. The peace process continued with the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267, which granted Llewellyn ap Gruff an extensive control in Wales. The Statute of Marlborough, issued the same year, reformed laws and helped restore order. For Edward, now 28, the world seemed less exciting without war. With peace at home, he turned his attention to the Holy Land. King Louis IX of France was planning a new crusade to fight the Mamluk Sultan Baybars. Edward, eager for military glory, raised funds and convinced the knights of the Shire to support him. He settled disputes, put his lands in trust, and named his uncle Richard of Cornwall as guardian for his children. On August 20th, 1270, Edward and his crusading party set sail from Dover, bound for the east. Edward's journey to the Holy Land was fraught with challenges. King Louis IX died in Tunis, and the French army returned home. Edward, undeterred, arrived in Acre in May 1271. The Christian presence in Outremer was weak, and most of the great cities were lost to the Mamluks. Despite the odds, Edward stayed for over a year, organizing raids and seeking alliances with the Mongols. On June 17, 1272, Edward's 33rd birthday, he lay in bed with his wife in Acre, reflecting on the difficult year. His small force had suffered from heat and disease, and the Mamluk leader Baybars had superior forces. The titular king of Jerusalem, Hugh III, had signed a peace treaty with Baybars, which Edward found frustrating. As he drifted to sleep, Edward was determined to make the most of his time in the Holy Land, even if the chances of a great victory were slim. That evening would forever be etched in Edward's memory. As he slept, a messenger claiming to be a renegade diplomat from Baybars arrived, bearing lavish gifts and promising to reveal crucial secrets. The guards, convinced by his urgent plea, woke Edward from his sleep. Still in his nightclothes, the prince met the stranger. The messenger's true intent soon became clear. He lunged at Edward with a dagger, aiming to strike him in the hip. But Edward, a skilled fighter, was quick to react. The chronicler known as the Templar of Tyre described the scene. The Saracen stabbed Edward on the hip, making a deep, dangerous wound. Edward, feeling the strike, punched the Saracen hard on the temple, knocking him to the ground. Then, grabbing a dagger from the table, Edward stabbed the man in the head, killing him. Edward's wound was severe, and his attendants feared the dagger might be poison. Legend says that Eleanor of Castile, Edward's wife, tried to suck the venom out of the wound, though it turned out the dagger was not poisoned. Still, the risk of infection was real, and a skilled surgeon had to cut away the infected flesh to save Edward's life. After a long recovery, Edward, Eleanor, and their young daughter, Joan, left Outremer for Europe in late September. They stopped in Sicily, and then traveled to Italy for Christmas, where they received news of Henry III's death. The old king had passed away in November, and Edward, now king, prepared to return to England. He took his time, enjoying his reputation as a crusader and settling affairs in France and Gascony. Finally, in the summer of 1274, he set sail for England. Edward landed at Dover on August 4th, 1274, after being away for nearly 4 years. The country welcomed him with enthusiasm. The coronation was set for August 19th. and the preparations were magnificent. The city of London was draped in gold cloth, and the streets were filled with pageantry. Edward processed from the Tower of London to the Palace of Westminster, staying overnight in the richly decorated painted chamber. The next day, the abbey was packed with nobles from England and its neighbors. Edward made an offering at the altar and took the coronation oath, promising to protect the church, do justice, and uphold the rights of the crown. He meant every word, unlike some of his predecessors. One of Edward's first priorities was to address the corruption in royal administration. He launched the 100 Rolls Inquiries, a massive survey of royal rights and abuses. Royal commissioners visited every 100 in England, asking local juries about the wrongdoings of royal officials. They uncovered many issues, from beatings and illegal imprisonment to bizarre schemes like a sheriff planning to release flying cockerels with incendiary bombs over London. Though not all issues could be addressed, the inquiries sent a clear message. Edward was committed to reform. Edward was also deeply inspired by the legend of King Arthur, which was hugely popular in 13th century Europe. Arthur's stories, filled with chivalry and valor, had been retold and embellished over the centuries. Edward saw himself as a new Arthur, determined to bring order and justice to his kingdom. He was particularly interested in the Welsh, who believed Arthur would return to liberate them from English rule. Edward, however, had a different plan. In the summer of 1277, Edward assembled a large army to march into North Wales. His goal was to subdue Llewellyn the Last, the Prince of Wales. Llewellyn had been a constant threat, invading English territories and refusing to pay the agreed-upon tribute. Edward's army, supported by his barons and knights, was a show of England's might. They advanced along the coast road from Chester, their banners fluttering in the wind, determined to bring Llewellyn to heel. Wales had always been a challenge for the English. Llewellyn the Great had ruled most of Wales until his death in 1240, and his grandson Llewellyn the Last had further expanded Welsh power. The Treaty of Montgomery in 1267 had recognized Llewellyn as the Prince of Wales, but it had come at a cost to Edward, who had to give up land in Wales. Llewellyn's refusal to pay the agreed-upon tribute, and his provocations against English barons made war inevitable. Edward's campaign in Wales was a step toward fulfilling his vision of a united and peaceful kingdom. He saw himself as a new Arthur, a king who would bring order and justice to his lands. As the cold winter of 1282 settled over the rugged mountains of Wales, the fate of the principality hung in the balance. Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, the last native prince of Wales, had been fighting a desperate battle against King Edward I of England. For years, Llewellyn had tried to maintain Welsh independence, but the relentless pressure from Edward's well-organized and well-equipped army was proving too much. In 1277, Edward had already defeated Llewellyn once, forcing him to surrender and accept a humiliating treaty, but the Welsh spirit was not easily tamed. Llewellyn's brother, Defied, had grown increasingly resentful of Edward's rule and the English king's attempts to impose English laws and customs on the Welsh. In the early hours of Palm Sunday 1282, Defied launched a surprise attack on Hawarden Castle, igniting a rebellion that quickly spread across Wales. Llewellyn, who had initially claimed ignorance of the plot, soon joined the fight, rallying the Welsh princes to his cause. This time, Edward was determined to crush the Welsh once and for all. He assembled a massive army, complete with engineers and a fleet of ships to blockade the coast. The English forces marched into Wales, cutting a wide path through the forests and building roads and castles to secure their gains. Despite the Welsh fighters' bravery, the English army's superior numbers and resources began to take their toll. In November 1282, the Welsh dealt a significant blow to the English, ambushing a force led by Luke de Taney near the pontoon bridge to Anglesey. Many knights drowned in the cold waters, but this victory was short-lived. As winter set in, the English tightened their grip on Snowdonia, the heart of Welsh resistance. Llewellyn, desperate to avoid starvation, led a last desperate sortie from his stronghold. On December 11, 1282, he was ambushed at Irfan Bridge. In the chaos of battle, Llewellyn was killed, his body decapitated, and his head sent to London as a grim trophy. Llewellyn's death marked the end of independent Welsh rule. Defied continued the fight for a few more months, but without his brother's leadership, the rebellion faltered. In April 1283, the last Welsh stronghold, Castle y Barra, fell to the English. Defied was captured in June and taken to Shrewsbury for trial. He was found guilty of treason and executed, marking the final chapter in the struggle for Welsh independence. Edward's victory was not just a military triumph, it was a symbolic one. The English king had not only conquered the land, but had also sought to erase the Welsh identity. He built massive castles across Wales, from Aberystwyth to Harlech, to assert his dominance and to serve as a constant reminder of English power. The Welsh language and customs were suppressed, and English law was imposed. Yet, even in defeat, the Welsh spirit endured. The memory of Llewellyn and the fight for independence lived on in the hearts of the people, a symbol of their resilience and pride. Edward's victory was complete, but the story of Wales was far from over. The struggle for identity and freedom would continue, echoing through the generations to come.